I don't have a question, I just have a point or an observation. I think one of the biggest things, and it's not just news related, is that, when you look at different kinds of content, today when you look at television, you have abusive language beeped out. Even if it's subtitles, it's, crossed out. Then you go into a music streaming app, and all they do is put the word explicit to ensure that you're saying that, okay, there's a four-letter word here. Now, if I'm listening to music with my kids, I know on TV I don't have to worry them watching it because, Max, if you're watching Suits, there'll be shit, but, that's okay. But when you're listening to music today, there is no, when you talk about regulation, it's even in terms of content of that kind. And digital has taken it to another level. There are very few people on digital where I have seen that they have used abusive language and they've beeped it. I think there has to be some, yes, the question is again, who decides that? But I think if television is one of the mediums that we use as, maybe the one that really creates the first, decision in one sense, either it should be everywhere or it shouldn't be anywhere. It just doesn't make sense that one medium has it and then the other mediums don't.
So then is the solution a deregulation of offline or traditional news? Because we're discussing news, entertainment we're going to discuss in the next panel, but is it deregulation of traditional news?
See, I think for news it's always about, is it real news or is it fake news? The regulation is more on that matter.
I think the jury is out on what is fake and real because nobody knows anymore.
Yeah, but my thought there is maybe, if you have all of the players, and obviously you've got to have some standing in the industry to call yourself a strong player. But if all of the players who are, of a senior position can maybe come together and then list out these are the areas that need to be, then take it to the government and say, okay, now make it a law. So that it does become a precedence of that kind. So when a new person comes in, he's obviously going to take some time to, become big.
Or go completely off those norms and do something completely subversive.
I don't think that's the right approach. Especially, if you're trying to, because today news is read by kids also, and at the end of the day, you want to make sure that they're also getting the right information.
Okay. So one of the points that was made at one of the discussions we had held on privacy, and Arun mentioned it in Delhi as well, is that you don't regulate for the exceptions, you regulate for the norms. So I'm not sure if everything needs to be kept regulated according to whether it is meant for kids or not in that sense, right? And there I think what we've seen in the UK is that there's a separate set of norms, or there are tools that parents can use to ensure that kids don't visit certain sites, or some sort of censorship comes in at that level instead of the state mandating it.
It's more an observation than a question. It's agreeing with a lot of what the panelists said, and there is just one thing that comes to mind, which is this: regulation is coming. Whether we like it or not, worldwide regulation is coming because the media has just gotten out of control. Not the entire media, not the responsible media, not the senior media, but some little guy sitting in Slovakia who decided to change the American elections to earn certain dollars to buy a backpack. And that's happening in India. So you have two sets. One set is one which is doing it for the clickbait money, the other which is doing it for passion. Neither of them are really looking at the rules as we see it. For them, it's something they do because they have to do it. And if we want to see the worst case scenario of regulation and action, I think China is an extremely good example. The way they filter out words, the way they scrub out stuff from the internet, the way they ban people, the way they're giving credits and so on. And therefore the question is, before the government comes in with regulation, what do you do to prevent it? And the answer is, how do you create a model or a framework for self-regulation in a manner in which we can weed out the nasties? Even if that means the equivalent of a wool mark, you know what a wool mark label is, which tells you it's authentic wool. If you have the label, it's a good site. If you don't have the label, it's not a good site. Some kind of a regulation which will at least allow people to filter out what is acceptable and what's not, without political bias. And that's going to be the tricky one here.
So actually, Miten Sampath at one of our discussions on fake news had mentioned a sort of a series of nutrition label sort of a thing for
Yep.
news. And I think there are platforms that are now considering that approach. Facebook is experimenting, I think, in Canada with marking or with validation either from Wikipedia or from hiring 10,000 people as,
Yep.
as editors for doing that sort of work. But then are we going to be dependent on platforms to then tell us what is real and what isn't?
No, I don't think it's a platform. I think that there needs to be a self-regulation body, a body of people in the digital space who come together with it's like a movie classification. There's an X-rated movie and there is a PG-rated movie and there's a universal movie and whatever else. And I'm not saying that equivalent, but you'll have to come up with a kind of grading. For example, if you have something that puts out fake news all the time, or which is a high offender as far as Facebook, as far as fake news is concerned, sorry, that is a Freudian slip. Then how do you plaster it with that information? How do you put a public interest warning on it?
No, I think I think Harini, your points are very useful because just in the last 2 to 3 weeks, we've seen fake websites come up around the Karnataka elections, publishing fake stories with fake polls, with fake names of pollsters and so on, and very, very imaginatively done. And obviously, as they get more imaginative, the more difficult it is for people who are reading it. And these are people who, in any case, it's distributed to. These are willing recipients of that content, and that's really what Cambridge Analytica was about. So, the nature of subterfuge is also changing, right? So until recently, most of the fake news used to go out on WhatsApp. About 95% plus fake news. Fake news is distributed on WhatsApp. In the last few weeks, like I said, we are seeing it move on to websites. When it comes on to websites, it goes back to the Slovakian, or I think it's Macedonian example, that part of the world. So yeah. So, if someone is sitting somewhere else and creating content, maybe to earn a few clickbaits, which is what they were doing, or for some other objective, what can we do about it? And what can we do to, in some ways, at least stand out from that? Okay, so now what is happening in the fact-checking world, at least, is that the Poynter Institute in the US has created there's an international fact-checking network which sits under the Poynter Institute. They, in turn, have created a whole certification process which gives out a verified tag. Now, the certification process, so we've been through that certification process for Boom and FactChecker, actually, both. And the certification process looks for about 4 or 5 things. It looks to see what is the body of content that you've done in the last 6 months to a year. It looks to see whether you've been unbiased. So for instance, have you been only hitting the BJP, or have you been also writing against the Congress or finding things against the Congress? And there are sort of benchmarks about what you allow for how much. Second is, how much transparency is there about the people who run the enterprise? So one thing you notice about fake news websites, you have no clue who's behind it. Right? You go into About Us, there'll be nothing. You try and go below, you try and sort of follow the trail of the website and so on, you usually find nothing. So the second is transparency. Third is bios and CVs of the people who are actually writing the articles. Fourth is there an internal process to ensure that people who are aligned in some ways, if they're aligned, then is there some sort of internal transparency about that alignment? And broadly, which is a little more subjective, is the entire enterprise aligned or not? In any direction. So I think this is what people will have to do or will have to follow in some ways, but that is at one end. On the other, but that's not going to solve the problem of what I think is proactive self-regulation, because I think, like I said, in the real world, having seen it in the broadcasting system, if you don't move first, the government will move. And if the government moves first, then you've had it. Right? The second thing is that when you form some sort of self-regulatory, let's say, caucus or cohort, you're able to defend each other in some way. So let's say tomorrow even Reddit comes under attack for some reason. If I know that we're all part of the association, we will defend him. And there's nothing wrong in that. That's the way the world works. And similarly, if tomorrow we come under attack for something, it's quite likely that they will. And the government too, and because this is the real world, right? The government too likes to talk to institutions and bodies and not individuals. So if something goes wrong with the TV channel, maybe they'll do some back channel questioning and so on and so forth. But in all probability, first thing they'll do is ask the National News Broadcasting Association, okay, some of your members have been doing this, or we'd like to bring to your notice that some of your members have been doing this. So what do you have to say about it? So then, of course, is whether they will push back or they will entertain it, because it might deserve entertaining. But I think there's no substitute, and I'm entirely with you on what you're saying.
So I have 2 questions. First question is, this sounds like we've done, in general, to everyone. Well, the first question seems to be that we seem to have done this before. because generally speaking, the BBC has been checked for bias, and it's generally been found to be relatively unbiased. And it's been found that the people, at least from what I remember reading, that the people who were saying... Correct. And what's also been found in one of those is that quite often the people who are complaining about bias, it shows their bias. Right? So, even in the good old days, for saying that this person was an authoritative source did not necessarily pass muster with a lot of people. So, this sounds similar to that. Now, my next question is, how will this happen in real life? You will post an accredited link from XYZ institution, which has the highest credentials. It will land up on Reddit, and the first comment will be, XYZ news site, never trust them. They only talk about XYZ topic. And then the rest of the conversation is going to be about the website. So you may have high quality information. We're not really lacking for high quality information. Will that get to people?
I think it's much more like looking at somebody like a MasterCard or a Visa, that kind of unbiased organization, not them, accrediting these sites, somebody without innate political agenda. Whether it's an AI company, don't know what it is, but it needs to, bias cannot be regulated. I dislike somebody because I dislike them. But the moment I start spreading falsehoods about them, that's when the problem arises. The problem is not bias. Everybody has bias. So I think that you need to be able to have somebody, maybe a dispassionate entity, whether within India, which offers some kind of verified tick to news sites, because we don't even know. I was preparing a business plan a few months ago. We were trying to figure out how many news sites exist in India. The answer is nobody knows.
And why should you?
I think you should. I think the moment there's a newspaper, I know who is publishing it. I think that the transparency part which Govind
we
pointed
get into
out,
this whole issue of licensing, you know.
not licensing. I think that
Because you are going to
I'm not saying the
have-
government needs to license. I'm simply saying
why-
that I need to know,
Why do you need to know?
because I need to know what your bias is.
An
Geeta.
advertiser would probably need to know.
No, I think the consumer
But
needs to know.
why
If-
would a consumer, why would anybody want to know how
I want to
many-
know where the money comes from as a reader.
Yeah,
I want to know if
that's
it's a
different,
builder.
that's
I want to know
different.
if it's a mafiosi. I
That's
want to know
different.
who it is.
Then that goes into what he was saying
Transparency.
about being absolutely transparent
Yes.
about the who owns that site.
Absolutely.
You know, the point that you were
Yeah.
trying to make about verifying the site. And that gives us a whole, an entirely new area of media literacy which everyone needs to have.
Absolutely.
So that's a, that hasn't even come up at all, and I don't know if it did come up earlier, but media literacy is absolutely
Absolutely.
important. The problem is when you start to say that some verification process needs to be undertaken. For instance, I'm just thinking aloud, who's going to be doing that verification? And who are you going to give the power to decide which site has to be verified, which site is not to be verified, how many sites are verified according to this classification or that? It hasn't worked. It hasn't even worked with video games.
I think just one thing I would like to say. I'll
It's
tell
just
you
not work.
who will not verify in my universe.
I-
The government will not verify, because the moment the government verifies, it becomes a problem.
And
Now-
frankly, for me, it's not even about verification. It's about, when we talk about self-regulation, we have seen the experience of self-regulation, which hasn't worked. But I'm all for self-regulation. I'm totally committed to the idea of self-regulation. The problem is, how do we regulate one another?
Also, Harini,
Who is going to be able to decide that we have the power to regulate one another? In principle, we will all say that we are all equal and we will all regulate one another because we believe in the whole principle of self-regulation. All of that is fine. It doesn't actually happen.
Also, in practical terms, what will happen is that the moment, let's say, some accreditation agency comes up and says you can trust alt news but you can't trust postcard, a counterpart will come up on that side and say you can trust postcard but not alt news. And then a lot of people will choose to believe that. And what do you do?
so
in practical
you'll have a marketplace of accreditation, but I mean, no. So, but I'll come to this on the point that if there is going to be regulation and accreditation, if I have to be seen as a legitimate news source and entity, I'd rather be a blog and be unregulated. Why would I want to take more burden on myself and the same thing that we've seen with the failure of self-regulation? Why would I want to subject myself to third-party scrutiny and any kind of penalties, even if they're not enforceable,
Nikhil,
instead
but
of being an
one,
independent?
I don't think we should say self-regulation has failed completely. I think it fails on the extreme I think it fails when there are situations where clearly maybe there is inability to exercise strong authority. But I think the fact that there is self-regulation puts a check on at least some activity. I mean, I can't get too finite about this right now, but I think to say that it's a complete failure is not fair. That's
No, so those who want to self-regulate are already self-regulating. Those who don't will not, in that sense, is also the way it's going to be.
I want to talk about, first of all, to say that if I have a blog and I'm not completely I'm unregulated as opposed to a news website, that just seems to be a rather large gaping loophole in any sort of regulatory network.
Actually, it's not, because we're all covered under the IT Act.
Of course. But also, it seems like a very neat and happy way to get out of the regulation conundrum, because the simple fact that you cannot regulate, say, something like a news as opposed to a blog. But
And as a benefit, I mean, I started Medianama in 2 weeks.
Right.
Whereas if I had to start a newspaper or a TV
It would
channel, I
take
would
you.
never have been able to from
Precisely.
that perspective. So, I mean,
Thank God for that.
Thank you. But even Ankur here, who used to run a blog, again, started with no need for anyone's approval from that perspective. And that's what
which
the
is
internet
the
has
thing
given
about the
us.
internet, exactly. Which then brings me to the point of the internet and dissemination of news itself, which is this idea of public space. I mean, we're talking about some sort of Habermas idea of the public square as people who are talking about it, and now Facebook or Reddit, and who tend to escape into this nice little block of saying, oh, since we're a private entity, we no longer, we are simply a dissemination engine, we will be ruled by market forces, etc. But is that not a far more complicated issue now with these transnational sort of institutions which allow the spread of a lot of not just news, but information and viral posts, etc. And the complication thereof, of the regulation within, say, something like Reddit, of being, or Facebook, or Twitter, or anyone saying, you cannot say this, or you're being abusive, or you're being something else, because they are now the public space, whether we like it or not. And of course, it's a private entity, and if you don't, if you don't agree to our licensee terms or whatever, you choose to stay out. But is that really a choice I, as a consumer of media news, am allowed to make? This is again, of course, a problem of strata and of economic policy, of how someone who's poor or someone who doesn't have access to the internet does not get to read news on Facebook or Reddit, and someone who does.
I think that's a different sort of...
That's a slightly different issue, but also the issue of the public space itself, and of the paternalistic state versus the sort of coercive state, where you're saying, while the government is tasked with having to protect my rights, it also cannot become the sort of regulatory overlord above. These are very sort of clear, problematic tensions that I think we also need to address.
You know, this whole problem about what is a public space on the internet is really something we have gone away from in a big way. And I'll give you an example of how Facebook, for instance, any post on Facebook can be pulled up, can be, you know, there can be punitive action for any person who supposedly violates some kind of a norm.
Historically, you had a situation
earlier
of
we
the
had
Norwegian Prime Minister who uploaded a historic image of, you know, a naked Vietnamese child running with a napalm bomb, if you remember, right? So that, again, was an instance of Facebook censoring it for nudity.
Facebook censorship, I mean, we can have a separate session altogether on that. So I'm not going to go into that. My point was not that. My point was that in the early years of Facebook, there was a very interesting case which came up, I think, in the US, I don't know exactly where this young student wrote about her teacher, and she said, I hate Sarah Phelps. That was the name of the teacher. And then she was suspended by the school. But the argument that was used there is that Facebook was a private space. It was not a public space. And therefore, if the student was speaking up and speaking out and exercising her free speech in that private space, she had her rights to do that. Now, we have moved away from that completely, because we think of Facebook as a public space. We think of it completely as a public space, even if we may have, you know, groups of friends who we exit and friends. So in some ways, we have allowed this to say that yes, this is a public space, it is not a private space, and we cannot argue that at all. We've had instances of people who've been arrested because of Facebook. In jail, they've spent time in jail, months in jail.
This is the problem there. That's something that is considered a public space, is administrated by or is run by entirely for-profit motives by these massive transnational corporation. Then if our public space then becomes subordinate to a profit motive, that changes.
How else do you think Facebook is going to run?
Yeah, no. So
Facebook is not a non-profit. I mean, that's how they're going to run.
I don't think commercial considerations need to come into this, because the space wouldn't exist. That space wouldn't exist if it wasn't for a profit motive from that perspective. I think what you're talking about is censorship for a profit motive is something. So I think maybe we have to look at it in terms of regulating for harms to free speech rather than general operations of that space in that sense.
So I have an idea which should be perfectly horrible to everyone. We take the Reddit source code, we host it by the Indian government, and we make everyone have a free account. Then you have your public space governed by the government.
Also Aadhaar linked.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. So then you have all the public spaces then owned by the government. They can do what they need to do for all the public discussions, and then we can all be perfectly unhappy.
Two things that I wanted to talk about. One is, I think the nature of how we consume and distribute news has changed so dramatically that it's impossible to classify it as strictly sort of what is news and what isn't. So, for example, how do people like me get to hear that Shashi Kapoor has died? Not because we go to a digital news outlet, but because I go to my Facebook feed or to my Twitter feed, right? So we could argue that the person from whose stream I got that news effectively for me becomes a news producer, and I in turn become part of the chain of news producers, right? So what I'm trying to say is that I don't think we can apply the traditional framework of news and non-news when we are both producers and consumers online. And from a content regulation perspective, I'm particularly worried because I'm part of the Wikipedia community, and a lot of people get their news from Wikipedia, even though it doesn't see itself traditionally as a news source, but as an encyclopedia. So just to say that I think these boundaries have blurred so much online that taking this very hard approach to news as part of content regulation doesn't personally make sense to me. Also, similar to the discussion we're having about Facebook, right? Is it public, is it private? It's both, actually, in my opinion. And it's also semi-private in certain ways. But that's a different thing. But the other thing I really wanted to talk about is something that you had talked about, is sex and sexual content. So the nonprofit that I run, we have a couple of publications online. They're not blogs. They are neither entertainment nor news. We publish on Medium, and both of them have some information or content that could be classified as sexual. So for us, we are already quite worried because as small publishers, the way we get readership is by doing what all small publishers online do. We use social media, right, to promote. Sometimes when we boost some of our posts and content, it gets flagged in Facebook as harmful sexual content, and then we can't run those ads to promote, right? So our readership gets directly affected. We then have to sort of like reach out through whoever we know at Facebook to help us, etc. I mean, this is just an unending saga, right? And if we didn't have connections at Facebook, we wouldn't be able to run half those ads. So already we are sort of coming into the net of what is considered illegitimate content or harmful merely because it has something to do with sex or sexuality. But I think the other issue with sort of stuff like sexual content and people like us who sort of fall in neither of the brackets of news or entertainment, but we are small publishers, is we also have a law under the IT Act, which is Section 67, which regulates obscene content. And we are also seeing how this particular section is now being used to regulate content previously classified as objectionable under Section 66A, which has now been repealed for being unconstitutional, right? So frankly, from our perspective, we feel like this space is already over-regulated. And we are having terrific problems putting out content that we see as legitimate, but others see as illegitimate, including intermediaries or platforms and the government. And we know about the porn ban, blah, blah, blah. So I just want to say that when we talk about free speech and free expression, it would really help people like us if we could put sexual expression in that mix and not think of only political or other forms of expression as being part of the bucket of free expression. I think sex is a very valid thing to talk about, or sexuality, and it needs to sort of belong in that bucket.
Two things. I mean, earlier when you'd asked a question, you'd also sort of referred to censorship by private companies, which are two terms that don't go together. Censorship always typically refers to the government stopping you from speaking out. With a private company...
But if you look at it from a scale perspective, many of these now private entities are operating at a scale larger than most states are.
It's not a question of the scale, it's a question of whether there's coercion or not. So for example, when I sign up on Facebook, and we also advertise on Facebook, the thing is, I've signed up for their terms of use. Now some of them might be stupid, they might be regulating, moderating content for the use of sexual language and so on, which is just stupid, but then I have other options and I can go to them. They are within those rights to set those conditions. For example, let me give you an example. On my podcast, The Seen and the Unseen, every time I say fuck, like for fuck's sake, even in a context like that where it's part of an expression, we bleep it out. We do that as a precaution because iTunes, that particular platform, has a rule that if a user complains about the use of the word fuck, they'll remove the podcast till something is done about it. So as a precaution, we just beep it out, which, as you would know, I'm completely opposed to bleeping anything out, but we do it for that platform. Now the thing is, we are on all the platforms. We can be on any platform we want to. They are within their rights to set those rules. If they're stupid, we are within our rights to go elsewhere. It's not a free speech issue because no one's preventing me from speaking out. I can speak out anywhere else. I'm not denying that there is a problem. The problem of fake news and the problem of what's happening out there is incredibly huge. But if
this dialogue has gone beyond news,
Right.
it's now about content in general.
content,
like
in
we
fact,
would-
just to make an additional point, which is not a practical point but a philosophical point, is that I don't see why we should distinguish between news and any other kind of content, or between individuals and corporations. Citizens should fight for the free speech of everybody, and government should infringe on the free speech of nobody. But these distinctions exist in a practical sense, so we have to talk about them. But the thing is, I'm not denying that there is a problem. There is a huge problem, but government regulation is a wrong answer that will make it worse. That's all I'm kind of trying to point out.
The problem is when you say we have choice, we really don't. Facebook and Google are disproportionately large on the web platforms. And what happened in Myanmar recently was Facebook took free basics there, which we fought against in India. And a lot of people had access to the internet, which was Facebook's internet. And that was used to propagate violence against the Rohingyas and everything. So, and again, on these platforms, when they regulate on their own terms and conditions, you can argue they're a private platform, but that argument stops when you are effectively monopolies controlling conversation on a platform of such a scale. So for that, I think, and I understand everyone's concern with the state having a form of regulation because we don't feel they're competent enough to do that or whatever, or the intent isn't the right way to go about it. But I do feel that progressive regulation that empowers the consumer of the platform, that is the user on the platform, and content creators who use the platform to publicize their content is the way to go.
Progressive regulation by whom?
Progressive regulation by the state, in the sense that it makes the platform answerable to the users and also makes the platform answerable to the content creators, like publishers on the platform.
I actually agree with you. We are not talking at... like Nikhil and I did an episode on my podcast called The Future of the Internet where we discussed this at length. And the thing is, yes, this is a problem that you can talk about competition and free markets, but the bottom line is that if you are going to have a presence on a social media platform, it's going to be Facebook. If you want to upload videos, you have to go to YouTube. You don't have any other place. That's a problem. And I don't have a solution for it, so I throw my hands up. No. But my thing is that government regulation is entirely the wrong answer because it will not work the way you intend it to work.
No, so I'll give you an example. For example, if I'm a content creator on a video content creator, the platform obviously I go to is YouTube, right? Now YouTube might have a policy on takedowns where it might say, okay, you can't.
We're going to go to entertainment content and discussions later.
So I'm saying even news contents, if I make news content on YouTube and all, and if they want to take it down, right now my only recourse is to reach out to YouTube and say, why did you take it down? And they might give me an answer that's satisfactory or not. But my point is there's some form of regulation which allows me to at least find out information more, that they should be compelled to tell me why they took it out, or why they regulated it, or why they demonetized it. At least that much I have the right to know, and I have the right to challenge that once I know what the issue is. And without any form of responsibility or regulation on them, they have no reason to do that.
Look, I agree with you, but the point is that
you
if
know,
you allow the government to regulate that, sorry, I'll just finish.
Yeah.
If you allow the government to do that kind of regulation, then for example, all anti-Modi satire will disappear from YouTube. You don't want to give them that power.
You know, it's really not just about satire disappearing or content disappearing. It's the fact that the state has the punitive power to be able to put you in prison. It has the power to be able to arrest you, put you into prison. It has the power to be able to do that. It's not just about what kind of regulation will come by the state. It has a mailed fist and it's going to use it. So it's not about just taking down content or blocking accounts or any other such silencing methods. It's a permanent silencing which is very, very dangerous. So let's rethink that completely.
Actually, just had a very basic question. As academic researchers, the first thing that we really identify is what is the problem that we're trying to resolve here, right? I'm not sure we have a clear articulation of what is exactly the problem that online content regulation, if any, should resolve. From what I'm hearing you say, and pardon my limited knowledge of this subject, is yes, people get offended by trolling, the classic problem that Reddit and other communities are trying to resolve. I'm not sure if one can claim that I have a right not to be offended. Is it an enforceable right at all? Even if it is, I mean, can the conventional economics, and I'm sorry to move towards the ideological framework here, can conventional economics of the courses bargain solve that problem? Can one litigate and say that you offended me, you know, this is the loss that is caused to me, and I'm not sure, I'm just throwing it out there. Is the right to be offended an enforceable right at all? That's my first question. And the second is, yes, the second problem that I see is the classic problem of fake news, which sometimes has as deep ramifications as change of regimes. I really want to question ourselves here. Are we offended by the fake news because it led to a change of regime that did not favor us? How come nobody spoke about, you know, the Scotland referendum, an outcome that we all loved? How come we are not investigating the fake news, or any news for that matter, that really led to it?
I think the right to offend is an integral part of free speech, and there's actually a UN report by the UN Special Rapporteur on free speech. Frank LaRue had released a report, I think 2 or 3 years ago. You might want to look it up.
I think we said it already. Let's restate it. The reason we are all sitting here is because the INB minister woke up one day and said we want to do something about the digital online space. And if we don't do this, which is including have these conversations and try and achieve some sort of balance, then we are going to be hit with something that we didn't want. So like in any other industry, I've seen it in broadcast for one. It is important and imperative that we create some sort of foundation or platform where we come together on a few things and agree to some kind of self-regulation. Because when the government comes after you, and you don't want the government to come after you, it'll do so in a manner that will really half shut you down, if not fully shut you down.
Sure, but where is the demand coming from? That's all I'm trying to figure out.
So to answer the specific economic aspect, so to speak, of your question, my issue is the working of the marketplace of ideas. Do human beings as a whole have the ability today to sift through and evaluate ideas and have authentic, real ideas dominate over fake news, or, as they said, advertisements to go help someone Macedonia buy bags? That is the fundamental problem I'm seeing. That we are discussing online content regulation, which is great. What is content and how on? And as you pointed out, that this is because the government has decided. But the larger question is the system working? And in many cases, people have found new methods to gum up the system, that they can saturate the market. They can stop sellers from being seen. They can saturate the little short-term memory you have with cat videos and other things, so that you're not able to process higher levels of information. The media cycle now is much faster. So your issue is that people themselves just don't have the bandwidth. They are tired. So this is one of the issues which is behind all of this. The reason that the referendum happened, the reason why Brexit happened, the reason why someone won in America, these are all symptoms of an older problem. That is the root cause, which from my perspective is being addressed through these conversations.
Okay, just to give you a quick laundry list, there is polarization, there is hate speech and incitement to violence, there is fake news, there is an issue of anonymity that empowers, that means that the person who's creating any kind of information or inciting violence or death threats, they're not able to track that person down. And lastly is the assumed need to control the narrative in society. And the last one, sorry, is the interference of foreign powers in the functioning of a democracy. So these are 6 that I've just listed
Sure.
out.
So I'm just wondering if we are taking into account the truthful news which lead to outcomes which we all like. When we actually are trying to figure out fake news is aggravating something, are we taking into account the truthful news as well? Or has this always been the situation?
I think what misinformation and the impact of misinformation has done is it's shed light on the misinformation, which people feel there's a need to address now. If the outcomes were what we wanted, yes, we didn't do anything about it from that perspective at that point in time. But this is very real. It's impacting the existence of a state at some level and the existence of a particular government at another level. And that's happening across the globe. Every government after the Arab Spring started worrying about how they might be impacted because of misinformation or of people collecting online and starting a revolution. It started from that, is what I've noticed. So, Christine, you had a point.
Just wanted to come back very quickly on that question of self-regulation that I found central in the discussion. And several of you said that self-regulation had failed. I wanted to better understand, to have a little bit more insight of make such statement. And I think it's probably important to have a few elements on this to maybe move toward that important aspect of how to maybe improve that self-regulation.
Very quickly, self-regulation in print media and in broadcast media has not been a success. The self-regulation that we have on in online media is really not an organized self-regulation, which all members, all players in online media subscribe to. So you have different platforms who have their own regulatory mechanisms. So they self-regulate within their platforms. But it's not something that all of them collectively participate in. What Govind was talking about was really putting a mechanism in place which everybody from online media will participate in and will actually put together.